name is Amy Meeker-Taylor. I am the environmental educator for Friends of the St. Clair River. Just so you guys know, we are live on Facebook, and we're also going to be recording this. So if anybody's uncomfortable with that and wants to keep their camera off, that is totally fine. So today, you guys are going to Sturgeon Science School. So this is the program, the same program we do for our fifth graders every year in St. Clair County. We're going to talk about sturgeon biology. We're going to talk about threats to lake sturgeon, and we're going to talk about the things that scientists are doing right here in St. Clair County to help the sturgeon population. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So welcome to Sturgeon Science School. The reason that we talk about sturgeon in St. Clair County so much is because there is no place else in the Great Lakes that has as many lake sturgeon as we do. Scientists believe we probably have the largest self-sustaining population of lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes. Last estimate was about 40,000 sturgeon between the Blue Water Bridge and Western Lake Erie. So we have a pretty healthy population. And every year in the spring, they come back here to the St. Clair River to spawn. So this is a lake sturgeon. What I usually talk about, I start at the beginning, right at his nose, and we talk a little bit about some of the features about what makes a lake sturgeon a lake sturgeon. So the first thing that you might notice about our lake sturgeon here is that he has these things hanging down in front of his face. These are called barbels. Barbels are kind of like whiskers. They help the sturgeon feel things that are in the rocks. So a sturgeon's habitat is full of rocks. That's the substrate that they like because that's where they find their food. They eat things like crustaceans and snails and maybe some fish eggs, things that are down there in the rocks. And that's also where they lay their eggs. So in their habitat, they have to have those rocks and they have to be the right size. So they use those barbels to feel for things in the rocks. And when they find something they want to eat, they're going to suck it up with their mouth, which is right here. And we'll see a better video of how their mouth works in just a few minutes. So this is their mouth. Sometimes the kids especially get confused with these three holes right here. And I like to do this. This is his eye. And the other two holes are part of his respiration system. So there's his eye. Behind this right here are his gills because he is a fish. So he's got gills behind that flap. What you might notice about this sturgeon is that he's got some little spikes on his body. Now, when sturgeon are very young, they're going to have a lot of spikes and they're also going to be a different color. And those are for protection. So a young sturgeon is going to be very spiky and he's going to have different colors on him, some brown and some white, some mottling. So that helps him to blend in and the spikes help protect him from getting eaten. The older they get, the less spiky they get. So if you saw a very big old sturgeon, they might be completely smooth. They might lose those spikes altogether. I got to move my thing here for a second. One other thing that you guys probably notice about our sturgeon is the shape of his tail. His tail is what we call asymmetrical. And he actually looks more like a shark than a fish because he's got that asymmetrical tail. So sturgeon are a very, very old species. They've been around the Great Lakes for about 100 million years, maybe more than that. Lake sturgeon as a species survived whatever killed the dinosaurs, which I think is amazing. They also managed, after the glaciers came through, they also managed to still come back after that. So I think that's really cool that as a species, they have not changed that much since the time of the dinosaurs. All right, so let's see here. Oops, hold on, I gotta clear my annotate. Oh. So before we go any further, we're going to talk about some important definitions. So we're going to talk about the threats to lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes, but we have to talk about what some of those words mean. So obviously the word extinct means they're gone, they're never coming back. This isn't Jurassic Park. We cannot bring them back. So once they're extinct, they're gone forever. Endangered means something is happening to them. Their numbers are going down, and we'll talk about why their numbers are going down and any species in general, why they might become endangered or go extinct in a few minutes. But if we don't do something to help an animal that's endangered, then it's going to go extinct. And threatened means something's happening, their population's going down, their numbers aren't quite low enough yet for us to consider them endangered, but we need to figure out what's happening so so they don't become endangered. So in the Great Lakes, lake sturgeon are considered threatened. And let's talk about why. So these are the reasons why animals or plants might become endangered or go extinct. I like to use the word hippo to help me remember what those reasons are. It doesn't necessarily have to be lake sturgeon, but these are the reasons that any animal or plant might become endangered or go extinct. I want to see if you guys can guess some of them. So if you want to type in the chat what you think the H might stand for, and I'll give you a clue. The word humans and people are not the answer to any of these. These are specific reasons why animals or plants might become endangered or go extinct. So if anybody has a guess for H, you can type it in the chat or just say it. That's fine too. We're a small group. So does anybody have a guess for H? What reason that starts with H might cause animals or plants to become endangered or go extinct?
Habitat loss.
Habitat loss. Yep, very good. So habitat loss. So in the Great Lakes, lake sturgeon, like I said, they really like habitat that has a lot of rocks in it. They like shallow, rocky water that's moving really fast. That is great sturgeon habitat. Unfortunately, that's not the best habitat for moving boats like big freighters. So in the St. Clair River and in the Detroit River over the past 100 or 150 years, a lot of their habitat had been removed and the river had been changed. It's deeper, it's been straightened so that we can move those big boats, but that destroyed the habitat for the sturgeon. In other parts of the Great Lakes, not so much here in the St. Clair River, dams have really impacted their habitat. It's blocked their passage to their spawning grounds. So that's another way that their habitat has been impacted. So habitat destruction is definitely one of the reasons why our lake sturgeon population has gone down. Anybody have a guess for I? What might I stand for? It doesn't necessarily, if you can't think of why it would relate to sturgeon, that's okay. But if you know what I might stand for, that would cause animals or plants to become endangered or go extinct, you can type it in or just say it. Nobody wants to guess? All right, so the I stands for invasive species. So an invasive species is an animal or a plant that is here. It's not supposed to be here, so it came from another country or it could even have come from another part of the US, but it's causing harm in some way. So it's outcompeting our native animals and plants for resources, for food, for space. And the one that we talk about a lot with the sturgeon is the sea lamprey. And you'll learn a little bit more about sea lamprey in our video. An adult sturgeon has very tough skin and the sea lamprey will still latch on, but it doesn't harm them as much as it will when they are babies. So the sea lamprey are impacting our sturgeon population. Does anybody have a guess for P, one of the P's?
Pollution?
Pollution, very good. Now I gotta remember which one is which. I think it's this one. Yeah, so pollution. So sturgeon, the main kind of pollution that impacts sturgeon, a lot of times when I talk to fifth graders, they know about air pollution and they know about trash ending up in the water. But an interesting type of pollution that really impacts the sturgeon is a type of pollution called sediment pollution. And sediment pollution is when the dirt or the soil ends up in the river. So we have all these trees and plants that are holding onto soil. That's their job, or one of their jobs. The roots of those trees holds onto the soil. But as we cut down trees and we remove plants from the side of our rivers and our streams, when it rains, the soil and the sediment is washed into the river. And if you remember, I said sturgeon like to have those rocks in their habitat. That's where they're finding food. That's where they're laying their eggs. And that sediment, when it covers the rocks, then they can't get to that habitat that they want to get to in order to find their food or lay their eggs. So the sediment pollution is one of the main types of pollution that's impacting the sturgeon. All right, anybody want to guess the other P?
Predators?
Not predators, that's a good guess.
Okay.
Population?
No, that's a good guess too.
Can't think of P words.
All right, so this is an important one. So the second P is poaching. So a lot of times when I do this with fifth graders, they say hunting. And the most important thing, they usually say hunting for the H. And the most important thing that I want people to take away from the difference between hunting and poaching is that hunting is legal. If you're hunting, you have a license, you're in the right place. It's the right season. You're not trespassing. You're taking the right sex of animal. All of those things are hunting, and that is legal. When you're taking an animal and you're not supposed to be there or it's the wrong season, then it's poaching. So poaching is the illegal killing of animals. Here in the Great Lakes, sturgeon are poached. The female sturgeon are poached in the spring when they are full of eggs. So when a female sturgeon is about to lay eggs, she can have up to 1 million eggs inside of her body, and that is caviar, and people do eat the caviar. So our lake sturgeon population is in trouble because they're being poached. All right, anybody want to guess the last one? What might that O stand for? This is the reason a lot of our fish are their numbers are declining. It's a big fancy word, overexploitation. Overexploitation usually means there used to be a lot and we just took too many too fast. So 150 years ago, there were so many lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes in this area that they were considered a nuisance fish. People said that when they were spawning, they would tip over boats, they would get caught in nets and they'd rip the nets. And so the fishermen didn't want them there. And they would catch them and they would just throw them up on shore and let them die, or they would use them for fuel. And in 150 years, we managed to decrease the sturgeon population by about 99%. Scientists think that there's about 1% of that historic population left in the Great Lakes because we just overdid it. One of the things I didn't talk about earlier when we talked about lake sturgeon biology is male sturgeon can live to be 50 to 60 years old. Females can live to be up to 120 years old. So they're a very long-lived species. However, they don't start spawning until they're 15 to 20. So males start spawning a little bit earlier than females, but it takes about 20 years for them to spawn. So when we get that population so low, and you have these babies that aren't going to spawn for 20 years, it takes a very long time to build that population back up. All right, so now, what causes all of these things to happen? What causes habitat destruction? What causes pollution? Who's poaching? What's the cause of all of that? I heard somebody say it.
People.
People. Yep. All of these things are caused by people. So when I'm talking to the fifth graders, we talk about how this is really sad and this is really doom and gloom and what people have done to the sturgeon. But let's talk about some positive things that people are doing now to help the sturgeon. So right now in the Great Lakes, what are we doing to help lake sturgeon? We have volunteers and scientists all over the Great Lakes that are working to restore habitat. We have people who are controlling for those invasive species. We have regulations on pollution and overfishing. So the St. Clair River is one of the only fisheries in the Great Lakes that has a sturgeon fishing season. Our fishing season is July 15th to September 15th. You have to have a sturgeon tag. You can keep one if it's between 42 and 50 inches long. So they call that a slot limit. If it's bigger than that, it has to go back. If it's smaller than that, it has to go back. So that is a very closely regulated sport fishing season. And there is no commercial fishing for sturgeon. And then the last thing that's happening in the Great Lakes is tagging and tracking of the lake sturgeon population so we can learn more about where they go and what they're doing. So I have a quick video we're going to watch about sturgeon habitat restoration. Let's see here. I lost my video. Hold on. Can you guys hear that? Could everybody hear the music as it started?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
The St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River, also known as the Huron Erie Corridor, are the international waters that connect Lake Huron to Lake Erie. Environmental changes in the corridor over time have resulted in a loss of habitat for fish and other organisms. This video is focusing on the successful St. Clair River Fish Habitat Restoration Project and the science and collaboration that made it a success.
We were so surprised that Lake Sturgeon We have been perfecting the habitat materials and determined that a certain size and shape of rock was important to maximize the space between the rocks. If there's too much space, the eggs could be washed out by the water. But if the spaces are too small, the eggs would not be adequately protected from fish and other organisms. The project team developed a plan and methods to build new spawning habitat to increase lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, walleye, and other native fish populations. We learned that water flow, water depth, and water temperature were all important in the placement of a spawning reef. Another important factor is the available nursery habitat downstream that is crucial for the survival of young fish produced on the spawning reefs. One of the most important components of these habitat restoration projects is the monitoring that we do before and after the reef is constructed. In this way, we know whether any fish were there using the area before we construct the reef, and we can document the success of our spawning habitat projects. This video shows that there were lake sturgeon eggs among the rocks and adult lake sturgeon in the area before the construction was even complete.
Human alterations in the system in the late 19th and early 20th century resulted in many changes. One of the largest was the result of widening and deepening for commercial navigation. In the Detroit River alone, a major modification in the lower river resulted in the removal of over 300 million cubic meters of limestone rock and other material from the bottom of the river. The result was a dramatic reduction of fish populations throughout the entire Huron to Erie corridor. In 2004, a collaborative group of university, government, industry, and non-governmental organizations established the Huron-Erie Corridor Initiative. The first two projects, one at Belle Isle in the Detroit River, the other at Fighting Island, also in the Detroit River, but in the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, have significantly improved fish habitat. And we've seen fish responding to our latest project in the St. Clair Delta while it was under construction. Fish habitat restoration is a key part of US EPA's strategy to restore impaired beneficial uses in the system. These restoration efforts will provide cultural and economic benefits, bolster commercial and sport fishing, and contribute to a higher quality of life for the people living in the corridor.
So one of the reasons I like to share that video, I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second. One of the reasons I share that video specifically with the fifth graders is because I love how it talks about science in the field. So you hear them talk about how they did experiments, they made sure they were using the right type of rocks, they continued to monitor all of those things. And this whole program is about helping students see that science really does happen in the field. Science doesn't always happen in a lab. There are things that are going on in the field. So that's one of the reasons I show them that video, because they talk about all of those science processes. All right, so now we've rebuilt this habitat. The sturgeon are there, we saw them spawning, and now we wanna know where the sturgeon are going, what they're doing, we wanna keep track of them. So scientists use 3 different kinds of technologies to track animals. Usually when I ask kids technologies, they know about the first one that always comes to mind is GPS. They all know about GPS technology. And we talk about if you are playing a game on your parents' phone, like Pokemon Go, that uses the GPS, what happens? Does anybody know what happens if you use your phone too long and the GPS is on? The battery dies, right? So if we put a fancy, expensive GPS tracker on a lake sturgeon and the battery died, then we've lost our lake sturgeon, and we've also lost our fancy, expensive tracker. Now, GPS technology is getting less expensive. It's still not small. They're still pretty good size tags when you think about what size tag you want to put in a fish. So they'll put GPS trackers on larger animals, like if they want to keep track of a specific sea turtle or a specific shark, but it's not really used to keep track of a whole population. The most common technology that's used with populations, especially fish, is called a PIT tag. PIT stands for Passive Integrated Transponder. And a PIT tag is about the size of a grain of rice. It's a little tiny microchip that goes right beneath the skin of the fish. It's the exact same kind of technology. If you have a dog or a cat that has a chip, it's the exact same kind of technology. The thing about the passive technology is it means that someone has to catch the fish, and they have to have the special wand to wave over it, and then they can get the information from the fish. Same thing happens with dogs and cats. If you lose a dog or cat that's chipped, you can't just go on a website and figure out where they went. Someone has to find your animal, they have to check for a chip, and then get the information so that they can contact you. So there are lots of fish out in the Great Lakes, sturgeon and other species that have those PIT tags in them that help scientists keep track of where the fish was caught, how big was it last time it was caught, how much did it weigh the last time it was caught. So that's used very commonly, but it doesn't really tell us a lot about how they got where they're going. So the technology we're going to learn about in our video from the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission is called acoustic monitoring. And an acoustic tag is about the size, the ones they put in the sturgeon are about the size of a C battery, and it goes inside the fish and it's giving off a noise. So acoustic means sound. So the acoustic tag is giving off a noise underneath the water, and all over the Great Lakes, there's a series of these receivers or little computers at the bottom of the rivers and the lakes. And when a fish swims by with that acoustic tag, the receiver hears it and it records it and it remembers. And then later the scientists can come back and they can download the data. So we are going to learn about that technology in the Great Lakes from the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. Here we go. Everybody have sound? There are points where I'm gonna talk over this. I just wanna make sure everyone can hear it. This video was made just for Friends of the St. Clair River by the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. And these are all the different partners that are part of this project that we're gonna learn about, the acoustic telemetry with Lake Sturgeon and the Great Lakes. So we're gonna go on a journey to tag and track a lake sturgeon using acoustic telemetry.
Hi, my name is Lauren Holbrook, and I'm a communications associate with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Have you ever wondered where a fish goes in its free time? Well, using acoustic telemetry technology to track fish movement allows scientists to answer that very question. Later in this video, you will get to see a researcher tag a fish with an acoustic transmitter and then release that fish back into the Great Lakes. Special tag readers, called acoustic receivers, are anchored to the bottom of the lakes and allow researchers to map a tagged fish's movement when it passes near each receiver. Before we get started, I want to explain some of those terms. An acoustic tag, also called a transmitter, is the device that is surgically implanted in the fish. The fish's size typically determines the size of its tag, and here are some examples compared to an ink pen. The smallest tag you see would go in something like a sea lamprey. Then the larger tags might be in species like lake trout, walleye, or sturgeon. These tags broadcast a series of pings into the surrounding water that are then recognized and recorded by nearby underwater acoustic receivers. An acoustic receiver looks like this. Think of a computer on the bottom, which records the data, and a hydrophone on top, which is a fancy word for a microphone that detects sound waves underwater. So when a tagged fish swims nearby, it is recorded by the receiver. Later, the researchers can download this information onto their computers and determine the fish's movement through the water.
So the little orange dots are all places around the Great Lakes where one of those receivers is in the river or the lake. So a tagged fish is going to swim by one of those receivers, and the receiver is going to record the data, and later on a scientist can go back and draw a line and kind of connect the dots to see where the fish went. So we're going to see an animation of a population of sturgeon moving through the St. Clair Detroit River system between 2015 and 2017. And I'm going to stop the video for just a second because sometimes this little snapshot of a map can kind of be confusing what we're looking at, especially if you're not local. So at the top of the map, you can kind of see Lake Huron started to appear there. So Lake Huron is the white right here. Lake Huron, then there's the St. Clair River, which flows into Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and then into Lake Erie. So the gray part on the right side of your screen is Canada, and the gray part on the left side of your screen is the US. So this is Michigan, and this is St. Clair County.
In the past, research crews have surveyed areas around the Great Lakes looking for lake sturgeon. It is likely that the connecting channel between Lake Erie and Lake Huron and surrounding waters supports the largest self-sustaining lake sturgeon population in the Great Lakes.
This connecting channel includes the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River, also known as the St. Clair Detroit River System, or the SCDRS.
As a little background, in this animation, each color dot represents an individual lake sturgeon. The colors indicate where each individual was originally captured. Different capture locations helps researchers understand how many populations may be present within the system. Also, in order to show 2 years of fish movement in a short time, this animation was on fast forward.
All right, now let's go learn more about the project that your tag is involved in. You will see fish get caught, tagged, and released, including your fish. Then, once the data has been collected, you will be able to find out where your fish went. Let's go.
So these are the lead biologists that were part of this specific project. And then these are some of the technicians that also helped out. Part of the reason that we show this to the kids is because when they go out on the Huron Lady, they get to actually see some of these people, and it's kind of neat for them. So the who, what, where, when, and why of our project. So this is a collaborative effort between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Michigan DNR, and the Ontario Ministry for Natural Resources. It's an acoustic telemetry project with adult lake sturgeon in Lake Huron, the St. Clair River, and beyond. And our fish was tagged in June of 2019 and hopefully is still out there swimming around and giving us data because we want to track the movement of this protected fish and determine where it moves throughout its life. So if you're not familiar with Port Huron, this is the Black River. So this is the smaller river that runs through downtown Port Huron and drains into the St. Clair River. This is where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service keeps their boat in the spring. This is really neat for the kids to see because for a lot of them, this is their backyard. And they're gonna head up the St. Clair River, so north of the St. Clair River, out into Lake Huron. That's the Blue Water Bridge that connects the U.S. and Canada. So Canada's on your right. And that was Lighthouse Park, if you're familiar with Port Huron. So the first thing we have to do is catch the sturgeon. So obviously the sturgeon aren't caught on a fishing pole with a worm. They have a process called set lining.
This diagram shows you the gear needed for the process of set lining. The actual set line itself is also known as the main line.
So in this diagram, the top here is the wavy part is the water. The orange parts are the buoys that mark where the anchors are. So when the scientists come back, they can pull the line in. So these anchors are holding the line to the bottom of the river or the lake. And then across the bottom of the lake is this line that has 50 hooks on it. So each of these is a hook that is baited with a round goby. And I like to tell the kids that round goby are the only fish that they're going to see get hurt in this video. There are no other fish harmed. So that's a round goby. Round gobies are another invasive species and the sturgeon like to eat them. So they use them as bait. And that's what the hooks look like. So this is Justin. He's one of the biologists that works on this project. He's attaching the hooks to the main line, and then he's going to drop the anchor. And then he uses the buoy, obviously, so they know where to come back to, because they're going to leave it overnight.
By pulling the gear in by hand, we help protect the fish.
So you'll see Justin carefully remove the hooks that didn't have a sturgeon on them, because they're going to put the line back out later in the day. So he has to, you can't just throw them in a big pile. He's got to make a nice setup for later. And then you'll notice once they have a fish on, they're not going to pull it up by hand. They're going to make sure they don't injure the fish. So they have to pull in the whole set line just to make sure that if there's more fish, they get them all off. And then once they have one, they're going to put it in what's called a live well on the boat while they pull the rest of them in.
And now for a couple fun facts about lake sturgeon. Did you know that sturgeon were historically abundant in the Great Lakes? And originally, they were considered a nuisance fish by early fishermen. But by the early 1900s, many populations were either greatly reduced or extirpated throughout their range due to overfishing, habitat loss, dam construction, and pollution. Extirpated means eliminated.
That's the live well or the holding tank.
Lake sturgeon are the largest freshwater fish native to the Great Lakes Basin. In the US, lake sturgeon are now recognized as a threatened species in North America and are listed as endangered, threatened, or of special concern in 19 of the 20 states throughout their range. Lake sturgeon are also protected in Canadian waters of the Great Lakes. One more thing. In upcoming footage, you might notice that the lake sturgeon is held out of the water for a bit of time. And this might make you wonder, is this okay? Lake sturgeon are a fairly hardy fish that can survive being out of water for a bit of time. Fishery biologists make sure that the fish are not out of the water for more than 3 to 5 minutes. If processing takes longer than expected, the sturgeon will be placed back in the water for a couple of minutes before processing is continued.
You can really see how that mouth works in this slow-mo video. So now we're going to measure and weigh our fish. That's actually, the fish is in that sling, so that's how they get weighed. So we record the length and the weight. And then they're given an external tag on their dorsal fin that lets someone know that there's a tag inside. They also will take a little clip of their fin ray, and they can look at that underneath a microscope and count the rings, just like on a tree, so they can tell how old the sturgeon is. They also check them for wounds from the sea lamprey. So they also collect data about the water, and one of the things they use when they're collecting data is called a Secchi disc. So a Secchi disc is a white disc with black markings, or a black disc with white markings, you choose. And if you'll notice, the rope is marked with increments. So what they're gonna do is drop that down until they cannot see it anymore, and then they're gonna measure how far down it went. So the Secchi disc is used to measure water clarity. Or turbidity is the scientific term. So this sturgeon that is gonna get tagged today weighs 26.5 pounds, and he's 48.6 inches long. At least he was 2 years ago. So you're gonna see a little fish surgery. It's not gross, there's no blood. I promise, please don't close your eyes. It's very cool. And these are the tools that they use. So this is the actual tag that's gonna get implanted in the fish. This is the scalpel they're gonna use to make the incision. This tool is called a needle driver, and it's what they use to help them do stitches. And then this is the actual filament that they use for the stitches.
ID is 4354, the serial number of 1298991.
So they actually practice doing sturgeon stitches on a banana. So if you wanted to know about how thick sturgeon skin is, it's about as thick as a banana skin. So the kids always want to know if they have to catch the fish to take the stitches out, and they are the kind of stitches that dissolve. And you can see there's a picture of a sturgeon that was caught about a year after its incision, and it just has the tiniest little scar. You can barely see it. So the last thing we have to do is release the fish. And here he goes. All right. So that fish is now out there swimming around in the Great Lakes. He's been out there for 2 years with that acoustic transmitter in him. The whole idea is that when the scientists download that data, if they have data from that specific fish, we go back and we share that with the fifth graders so they can see that data. What they very similar to the video we saw with the tiny dots moving around, only they just see their fish. So they get to see where their fish, the different transmitters that it swam by in the last 2 years. And hopefully we'll have some of that data for our fifth graders at the before the end of this school year. I'm pretty excited about that. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint. It is time for your Sturgeon quiz. Is everybody ready for your quiz? All right, so you have to unmute yourself if you want to answer the quiz questions. And if you already know the answers, you can tell us anyway. Here we go. Here is our Sturgeon quiz. All right. So, female lake sturgeon lay how many eggs each time they spawn? Is it up to 100, up to 100,000, or up to 1,000,000? Who knows the answer? Anyone?
100,000. 100,000.
Good guess. Anybody else? It is up to 1,000,000. So a female lake sturgeon, when she is ready to lay eggs, can have up to 1,000,000 eggs inside of her body. That's part of the reason that they're so that they get poached, because people like to eat those eggs. All right, what are the greatest threats to lake sturgeon living in the Great Lakes today? Is one of them invasive species?
Yep.
Yes. Is one of them loss of habitat?
Yep.
Yep. Overfishing? Yep. Illegal killing for caviar?
Yep.
Yep. And pollution. Yep. So all of those are threats to lake sturgeon. How many teeth do lake sturgeon have?
0.
0. Yep. And I didn't cover this one exactly. So in the St. Clair River, scientists have built reefs. We saw that video where they have rebuilt spawning reefs for the sturgeon. In the St. Clair River, they have built 3, but there are more than that throughout the whole St. Clair Detroit River system. But in the St. Clair River, there are 3. Female lake sturgeon live to be about how many years old? Anybody remember?
120.
120, yeah. True or false, Michigan prohibits commercial fishing for lake sturgeon and closely regulates the sturgeon sport fishing season.
True.
Yes, it's kind of a trick question, but it is true. Commercial fishing is never okay, and we have a very closely regulated sturgeon sport fishing season. The current lake sturgeon population is only 1% of its historic abundance of over 1 million fish. Is that true or false?
True.
It is true, yep. Lake sturgeon are one of the largest fish native to the Great Lakes. That is true. What do lake sturgeon eat? Do lake sturgeon eat snails?
Yes.
Yep. Do they eat fish eggs?
Yes.
They will. And sometimes they'll even eat, if they're their own eggs, they're not going to know the difference. Kids ask me that all the time. Do they eat their own eggs? Well, they might. Hopefully they don't. Do we think lake sturgeon eat water lilies? They do not. They do not eat plants. Oh, go away. I didn't mean to put you there. Whoops. Okay. Do lake sturgeon eat insect larvae? Yes.
Yeah.
Do lake sturgeon eat people? They do not.
No.
All right. When European settlers arrived in Michigan, lake sturgeon were so numerous during the spring season that they were reportedly capable of capsizing fishing boats. Is that true or false? It is true. They were a nuisance fish. All right. And finally, how can you help the recovery of lake sturgeon? I'm going to give you the answers. So how can you help? You can adhere to all fishing regulations and report illegal activity. You can get involved in the annual Blue Water Sturgeon Festival. You can volunteer with and support organizations like Friends of the St. Clair River that promote lake sturgeon conservation. And you can become knowledgeable about lake sturgeon and share that knowledge with your friends. All right. So the last thing I want to tell you guys, one other way that you can get involved that I didn't mention there. By the way, if you're interested in volunteering for Sturgeon Festival, let us know. We'll hook you up with the right people. That is June 4th and 5th here in Port Huron. If you are interested in adopting a sturgeon, we do have an Adopt a Sturgeon program through Friends of the St. Clair River where you can adopt a sturgeon. And then for those sturgeon are not acoustic tagged, they have the pit tags. So when they're caught by the DNR or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and it's reported to us, we share that data with you when your fish is caught again. So we do have that sturgeon adoption program available through Friends of the St. Clair River. All right. Does anybody have any questions? That was a lot of information. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, go ahead.